So thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about state capture and focus in particular on political corruption and how this leads to de-democratization. So the previous presentations, not only this morning, but also a lot of presentations yesterday, went through how corporate political activities, what kind of impact that have, and what corporations are doing, with health organizations or undermining science or and lobbying and so on. So I'm going to try to push that a little bit further and see what kind of implication that has for democracy. But before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of a background to who I am, because this is not my normal audience. You know, we normally are in our silos, and I think this is part of why I love this workshop, is because the breadth of scholarship from a range of different backgrounds, which I really have enjoyed. So I've been studying corporations and how they engage with climate change for quite some time, starting with what corporations are doing in this space, how they respond to the threat of climate change, also how they adapt to these kind of risks. And a lot of my projects are large qualitative projects where we go out and interviews, in this case, the CEOs and the sustainability managers, what firms are doing in responding to climate change. These also give me a chance to mention some of my co-authors that I work a lot with, like Chris Wright from Sydney University. We do a lot of these together in trying to understand how sustainability strategies not really working, so rather how corporations take in climate change and spit it out as business as usual. And as in corporations over time fail to act on climate change. We're also investigating what we call hotspots. So a lot of it in my discipline's research around climate change is on mitigation or what we plan to do. So future-looking aspects of how corporations engage with climate change. So we also looked at impact of climate change where we know it has an effect. One of these is obviously Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is bleaching on a more regular frequency. So we went up to Great Barrier Reef and tried to understand how is the tourist industry dealing with a bleached reef where there's nothing to see, it's just white. And how are they engaging with the communities around the reef. But also an area south of Newcastle, north of Sydney, where a land strip sits between a big salt lake and the ocean, which is getting obviously inundated with increasing sea level, and they see more and more flooding, how they are responding to impacts of climate change and try to build up. And the problem of building up, the community violently opposed the legislation around building up because that would devalue their properties. So we're looking into these kind of hotspots. Again, we go there and do interviews, trying to understand the politics of the situation. And then a couple of years back, a lot of this is funded by the Australian government, and a couple of years back we got funded by the government to understand the low carbon transition in the Australian energy sector. So they gave us money to study how Australia is moving to a low carbon economy, which is not. So instead then, together with my co-author here, again Chris Wright, but also Vanessa Bowden, I should mention, we work a lot together, we're trying to understand how come we are not moving to a low carbon economy. Considering in Australia, renewable is cheaper, so it's much, much cheaper to go solar, wind, or hydro than it is to go coal or gas. Considering that most people in Australia are for renewable and understand the importance of climate change. So how come we see this, I guess, path dependency on coal and gas? And that is sort of what leading to the presentation I have today in trying to unpack this, I guess theoretically, what are the implications, and in this case, how is the state captured, and what are the implications for democracy, and how come we become so dependent on certain industries. So I'm going to use, I think, all my examples around fossil fuel in Australia, but I think what I'm trying to say would be easily applicable to any, I guess, sin industry. That would be tobacco, gambling, and so on, sugar, where the societies well understand that this is problematic, that they would be for change in policy. However, there's no capacity for the state to legislate or change the direction they're going. So, for example, in Australia, almost everyone would be for not having increased taxes on fast food, but that would never happen considering the political dynamics. So I'm trying to unpack this using fossil fuel, but as I said, I do think it's applicable to other industries. So a few clarification here. So in terms of state capture, I mean the state here, political decision making, including the bureaucracy supporting the state's political decision making. I'm not talking about the country. Obviously, the countries are not captured. And I think the first slide we saw yesterday showed that people are well aware that private interests are influential in this. So people are well aware. So this is state capture, not country capture. And with democracy here, I separate that from the state, obviously, that democracy is a political system, which I strongly support. So I guess this is also a call for strengthening democracy. So in that sense here, there's not a case of legitimacy, that these firms have a strong legitimacy. Rather, it's a case of hegemony or domination. And I then try to show how this is established and keeping whole or keeping a country or a state in their grip. So we have seen this throughout the days, the different ways that corporations influence the different aspects of society. And what I've done here is split it into three different spheres. They're obviously analytically separated, not empirically they would be entangled, but for the purpose of unpacking democracy, I have separated these spheres. So they're all three different spheres that are important for the functioning democracy. So we obviously have the political sphere, where we take political decisions, where government take decisions, and we can see here in the political sphere how they are influenced by corporations. So these are corporate political activities, and they are direct. So this is what we have seen before: direct lobbying, campaign contribution, testifying expert witnesses in government legislation, inquiries. We also see how they are funded for travel and so on. The next sphere here is the public sphere. And this sphere is important for democracy for deliberation. So for a functioning democracy, we would have a sphere, what Habermas referred to the public sphere here, and romantically we've seen this perhaps in the coffee houses. This was not obviously an inclusive democracy because the women were not invited and so on, but it is important for a functioning democracy to have a public sphere where we can communicate and deliberate about what we demand from the public sphere. And again, we've seen some of this throughout a couple of days, how corporations influence this sphere. You can see clear, good example are how ExxonMobil run advertorials in New York Times, where they showed or diminished the idea of climate change. But they also advertise their importance for the country or in these kind of aspects. The press releases that the financial papers take up, they form super PACs in the US, and a similar organization science organization, but feed into the public sphere and the discussion. And finally, we also have the private sphere, where important for functioning democracy that you have the capacity as an individual citizen to come up with your preference and your interest. So in that sense, the private sphere normally is assumed to be around education, marriage, and health, and so on. This private sphere is important that we have the capacity and the freedom in these spheres to come up with our interests and preferences. So this is possible to analytically separate to understand how corporations, in this case, what I'm going to show mostly is fossil fuel, undermine the functioning of these spheres. And for democracy then, how does this work? So what I'm suggesting here is that in these spheres, they have slightly different functions. So the democratic processes in each sphere. So this, with democracy, I don't refer to a particular state of democracy that we can then apply to different countries and say, this is a democracy, this is not a democracy. Obviously, there is no democracy as an ideal state, but we can see there are democratic processes, and they can be on a better or worse, dependent on how these spheres are working. So we obviously would like to have political leaders that we have voted in that represent us. And we then have a say in the impact of the policies. So corruption then, as a derivate concept, is not referring to individual corruption, so individual corrupt politicians or businessmen, but refer to is the political corruption, which means the undermining of these democratic processes. So it's not quid pro quo or corrupt politicians, it's the corruption of democratic processes. And then I've separated them here in each sphere, so you can see how corruption works in each of the sphere. So the corruption in the political sphere would be that politicians respond to money that are not publicly justified. This means that citizens are excluded from being represented. So if a lobbyist pay or a company pay money to a politician or to a super PAC that influence, the representation is broken in that the citizen is excluded from the representation. And for example, a lot of politicians are dependent on corporate money, which means they rarely have time to do much more than trying to get money to the next election. So again, the representation is failed. And in the public sphere, we can see how money can be used to deceive, to create a particular agenda in the public sphere, and then there's failed participation and deliberation by citizens in this public sphere. They don't have the capacity or the wealth to participate. And finally, in the private sphere, we can see how the pressures to align with corporate interests suggest that then citizens doesn't really have the rights or protection to freely engage in political discussion. So again, the democratic processes are undermined. So, and this slide here is quite similar to Terry's initial discussion of power and trying to separate how this influence happens. So very simply, on a basic direct interaction level, we have corporate political activity, CPA. Here, they engage with, for example, lobbying to influence the decision making, and that means citizen representation is necessarily excluded. So here, all forms of lobbying exclude representation of citizens. These obviously have an influence on decision making because politicians get the information or money from, in my case, normally fossil fuel in Australia, and that facilitates corporate empowerment, but it also facilitates a dependence on cooperation. So we can see a direct interaction, create a club, membership, network that then is institutionalized as a system level. And that influence then is fed back to justify and reinforce more corporate political activities. And we can see that's quite easily in, for example, the US, where the money is increasing on a yearly basis because politicians become more and more dependent on money to get elected. So we can see the amount of money to get elected is increasing because the dependence, and I guess this circle of corporate empowerment becomes institutionalized in the country. So in Australia, we saw that clearly with the fossil fuel, and this book from Guy Pearce is amazing because he worked for the Liberal Party, and then he detailed in this book what he referred to the coal mafia, and how so the coal industry went to the politician, created a club that then institutionalized coal as a main resource for energy, and we can see the same with gas. And we also see other studies here with within the Edwards study. She went through different industries, but again, clearly illustrate how the influential voices of particular industries, and in this case, fossil fuel industry, for political decision making. So then, government, I guess, through these relations, so lobbying in this sense is not so much about information. Lobbying is about relations and pressure. Lobbying is not about here is my argument versus here is my argument. Lobbying is about creating relations and pressure on government. And we see then how these relations functions, and with money and influence also comes this, I guess, dependence. So an example of how this worked would then be after COVID, a lot of economies had a slight downturn, which was great for emission, not so great for the economies. But most countries then had some form of recovery in terms of economic stimulation. In Australia, the economic stimulation was gas-led recovery. So they created a committee for economic recovery. This committee was led by a gas executive. So following the deliberation of this committee for how we can kickstart the Australian economy, the solution was a gas-led recovery. We should be building more gas plants and drill for more gas. And this obviously is because of this network and club. So this is quite useful also for consultancy. We see that erosion of public decision-making, political decision-making through, for example, consultancies. PricewaterhouseCoopers did amazing stuff in Australia, became known because they played both sides. They were involved in Australian tax regulation, and then behind the back told the customers what legislation will come in a few years' time. So that was illegal in this sense. So they had to answer for themselves. And in that came out that they had power maps. So which politicians had what kind of weak spots. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, he had power maps of the most influential politicians, bureaucrats, how they were related, what were their weak spots, and so on. So they had mapped out all the politicians and bureaucrats to put more precise pressure on politicians. So the next sphere here is the public sphere, and the political corruption here works through the influence directs on deliberation, and that excludes citizen voices. So by having so much fossil fuel influence on the public deliberation in mass media or in newspapers, it facilitates corporate empowerment, and media becomes dependent on corporate money for survival. So we can see how most media in most places in the world today has moved from earning money on selling journalism to earning money on advertisement. So in Australia, obviously, the fossil fuel is heavily advertised. We also see how we see less journalism and more public relations. So if you take up Wall Street today, more than 50% of the articles in Wall Street would be press releases or public relations statements from corporations or industry associations. So what we're reading in newspapers today are, to a large extent, press releases from corporation industry association. So then, obviously, in Australia, where they're dependent on fossil fuel industry for the advertisement, for their content, we can also see how that would influence the public deliberation in minimizing the voices of citizens. I'm going to give you an example here that I think is fantastic. So this is 2010. After a long review of the tax system in Australia, the Henry Review, Kevin Rudd in 2010 May proposed a new tax on mining, and it was called Resource Super Profit Tax. So the idea was quite simple. Look, the mining industry in Australia are making a lot of money, like ridiculous amount of money. So we're going to tax not the profit, not the big profit, but the amazingly ridiculous profits. Take half of that, feed back into the mining industry so they can create new projects. This is not against, this was not a climate change thing. It was just, we need a little bit more. And half of that for the public coffers. So this review has gone through for at least a year with a lot of consultation with the industries, a lot of deliberation. And then in early May 2010, Kevin Rudd and the finance minister, Wayne Swan, should put this out to the public. This is a new legislation, a super profit tax. They're going to take top cap of the ridiculous profit and feed back half to the coffins and half back to the industry. The mining industry obviously failed that consultation. They've been involved throughout the consultation, still was quite unhappy with that. So the day after, the Prime Minister and Finance Minister publicly spoke up about this new super profit tax. The mining industry responded. And they responded violently in radio, TV, and newspapers. There wasn't a minute or a day or a part of the day you would not hear on radio how bad this tax was. Or full pages in newspapers how bad this tax was. commercials in TV how bad this tax was. That this tax is going to destroy the Australian economy. You know, the average worker has a pension. A lot of pension is through superannuation invested in fossil fuel. That's all going to be gone and dead. This is the worst thing ever happened to Australia. The hyperbolic was amazing for that little bit of tax. So the government tried to respond in the public sphere, suggesting, look, they took out their own commercials saying, look, this is not how it really is. We're just taking a little bit of tax, feeding a lot of it back to the industry. We just, you know, this is common resources. Coal is common resources. It's Australian resources. We should not have off an international company just taking those profits away. $22 million, which what is that? 14 million euros was spent over a month. That's not a lot of money, but in Australia it's not a huge country. Well, it's a huge country, but not population-wise. After 4 weeks of this continuous pressure, the government, the Prime Minister resigned. But the first new Prime Minister did, Julia Gillard, was peace talk with industry and abolishing this tax. So it took them $22 million, 14 million euros, to abolish a tax that over a decade would save the industry $100 billion. So you can see the return on investment here. There was no evidence that the Australian population was against the tax. But since they completely dominated the public sphere, there was very few voices from citizens or alternative voices in the debate. So the citizens were excluded from the public debate. There's no evidence people were against this tax, quite the opposite. But still, the politicians had no other way than to silence this, because the industry would continue. Because this is not a lot of money for an industry that gets together and share this bill to kill this initiative. So that's one example of how the mining industry has worked with in the public sphere. And obviously there are many, many others. And the final thing I want to mention here is then how political corruption works in the private sphere. So here is about citizen dependent on the influence or the preference of the industry, and then again facilitate corporate power because you don't dare to speak out against, in this case, the fossil fuel industry, and through our lives become more and more dependent through healthcare, privatized healthcare, education, privatized education, so we become more and more dependent on these kind of activities. So a lot of these mining towns, all the sports teams are funded by the mining industry. So then they become dependent on these community activities that exclude the preferences or possibility of preference building independently from the economic power of the industry. And we feel this also in our schools. So this is Hector. He's a coal lump, and he comes with a booklet of information around energy. And this is handed out to schools in Australia. Or if you look at school boards, so that sets the curriculum. Fossil fuel industry often represented on this educational board. So then in that sense, they dictate what kind of energy discussion we would have in primary schools. They would come with booklets to have a discussion on the importance of energy for Australia and tell our kids, carbon emissions is pretty good because it heats up the planet. And if it weren't for that, we'd be probably freezing. And sure, climate science, climate change, but who knows? So I have a personal anecdote. So obviously all my work is in climate change, which my daughters know of. And so one day when I was talking about my work, and my youngest, she was 10 at the time, I think she just bursted out at the dinner table. If it weren't for coal, we wouldn't have a house, we wouldn't have a car, we wouldn't... This emotional response to support an industry. Because obviously we live in Newcastle, which is a coal town, and all our friends have parents who live work for coal, and then you have information in schools comes often with energy solutions that are based on coal and gas. We also have fossil fuel funding universities. My own university, University of Queensland, have 2 institutions funded by fossil fuel. One to 51%, the other one is fully funded by fossil fuel. And we know from previously, through tobacco, through sugar, that these kind of funded research provide particular results. So very hard then, and I hope this is not recorded, joking. It's very hard then to speak out and form independent preferences where most of your livelihood, but also democratic capacities are dependent on, in this case, fossil fuel in Australia, but we can also see how we would be dependent on similar powerful industries in other countries. So what I would like to end on then, and so we will have some time for questions, is sort of discussing how these then interlock the dependence on, in my case, fossil fuel, but I think would be similar in other nations where perhaps gambling or sugar or tobacco would be trying to use similar strategy. So obviously one of these is the political capture, where the political decision making is influenced heavily by a particular industry. We also see what could be called as refeudalization, in the sense of that we're not looking at the industry as a part of participating or deliberation. Rather, industry here is presenting themselves for the country, as in you agree with me. And a lot of the marketing in that campaign I showed earlier against the resource super profit tax, there was no industry voices there. There was all voices by doctors, healthcare, or they were all actors obviously, but they had hats on or nurses' uniforms on to show there's not the industry speaking out. It's the everyday person, the average worker speaking out for the industry. So the industry is presented for the people rather than participating in deliberation with the people. And I guess this is a form of colonization also of the private sphere, where we have very little room in our lives to leave our economic worries at home, to participate freely in this kind of debate of democratic processes of how we want to engage. So corporate political activities here undermine democracies through these different spheres, and I will say no matter what they argue for, they undermine democracy. So some claims, especially in my field, that corporate political activities can be good or bad. Look, we saw Amazon, Apple, maybe I can't remember if Meta did it, but you can see the big industry came out against Trump's immigration ban. They came out for Black Lives Matter. They come out in what we normally see in progressive statements, supporting, well, somewhat progressive politics. So what then we'll see, and I had an interview last week, but someone said, look, there's a lot of lobbying against climate action. Shouldn't we have corporations lobby for climate actions? But what I'm trying to say here is even lobbying for something we would agree with undermine democratic processes, because it's not representative of citizens. So, and it's funny to note, not funny, but interesting to note that Amazon, Meta, all these companies that went out against Trump's immigration ban, for Black Lives Matter, none of them went out for unionization of the workplace, which is a democratic process. None of them supported redistribution through increased taxes. So we can see how, sure, it might feel good to have these big companies on, sorry for saying this, sort of our side as a progressive person, but they are not, because they're not referring to representation here. They obviously do that to selling their particularly thingy, whatever they want to sell. So what can we do then? Here obviously I have a few ideas that we could do in the different spheres to strengthen democratic processes. So what I've argued, corporate political activities weaken democratic processes, we can also do this to strengthen them. And one thing that we saw in France a few years back was the citizen assemblies around climate actions. While none of them were implemented, the ideas were freaking fantastic. Like, the assemblies of average people came out with awesome ideas compared to the politics. Sure, Macron didn't implement any of them hardly, but it really worked. While we didn't see much pressure for while the implementation failed, there's, you can see how assemblies actually come up with really good stuff. In the public sphere, we arguably need alternative platforms that are not owned by people like Musk and Zuckerberg and used for polarizing politics, but rather alternative discussion forums. Because at the moment, we don't have a public sphere that is not corporate owned, that have any type of influence. So finding this is another important aspect. And then finally, democratically organized delivery of human needs. And I do think, especially working on climate change, there are some awesome stuff happening around community energy, where communities take charge of their own energy supply. That would be solar farms or wind farms, where the community come together, perhaps together be able to buy a bigger battery, and then can be disconnected from a lot of the energy that is privately owned. And I think we also need to look to other alternative solutions here. So I guess my point here is not a frontal attack on capitalism, is finding an alternative to decrease our dependence on capitalists to take decisions about things that are absolutely needed in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned academic capture. I am proud to say that at Paris School of Economics, we don't accept any money from fossil fuel companies. Yeah. This is a strong position.
No, and it's a movement that is happening. Fossil-free universities, and it's a fantastic movement. In certain countries, it's easier than others, and then part of the problem is obviously the decrease of public funding of universities and the pressure on us academics to find alternative sources of funding. So at least in Australia, we can see the public funding for universities going down. Then the universities want us to find money elsewhere, which normally means private organizations.
I should say that we have some research shares funded by some private companies, but with very strong ethical control by the academy.
Yeah. But we all say that, though. Sorry.
I can say that. So, some questions? Non, on me dit là.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I just quickly actually looked for the website of Australian government in terms of the renewable energy growth. Like I saw what from 2016, you had a really big growth in Australia in terms of wind and solar. And in the framework of what you were saying now, how is it explained, this growth in 2016? Is it a bottom-up more initiative, or it's a government which actually changed its perspective on renewables? Thank you.
It's an awesome question, and you're right. We can see that the absolute growth of wind and solar. A lot of the solar is on Australian roofs. It's an absolute success. Tasmania today is basically driven on, which is one state, is driven on renewable. South Australia, it's 90% renewable. The problem is with renewable and we see the expansion of renewable, it's not replacing fossil fuel. It's just added on top. So we still see expansion of fossil fuel, and greenhouse gas emissions are still going up, and renewable is just laid on top. So the percentage of alternative energy is the same today as it is 40, 50 years ago. Around 80% is still fossil fuel. So in relative numbers, energy is 4 or 5%. But in absolute numbers, it's growing because energy consumption is growing. So it doesn't replace fossil fuel. So Australian coal and gas, they're scared of renewable. And they fight it really hard. What are you going to do when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine? And what are you going to do on the nights? And like we didn't invent the battery, right? So they're really scared. And as I spoke to David yesterday on the walk back to the hotel, the big discussion in Australia today is nuclear, which is fantastic because nuclear is not illegal in Australia as a country, but in every single state. So then you look at why does one of the major parties go full out for nuclear? The single only policy the Liberals have done since last election in opposition is we're going to go nuclear. And if you look at the supporters, Gina Rinehart, which is one of the richest women on the planet, she owns a bunch of coal mines, she goes, yes, we should go for nuclear. We should not go for renewable. And why is this? Because it will never happen. It's too expensive, it takes too long time, which means the coal and gas industry can continue. What they're scared of is renewable, because it works. Then we can see a shift in the public discussion, and newspapers, the conservative newspapers, they agree we should go for nuclear in a country that has banned nuclear, and every state has banned nuclear. And we know, how long it would take up to build a nuclear facility and get that working. It took decades. Hence, coal and gas, yes, we should go nuclear.
Yes. Another question? I thought so. Okay.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that point, have you seen any increase in anti-sobriety measures in Australia? For instance, insulation of homes, anything that would decrease the energy consumption? I mean, I know some other research folks like Jeremy Walker have done an amazing job documenting the Atlas network and other fossil fuel industry networks. But on really this specific point of let's say, sobriety measures run or driven by the industry. Do you have anything to share on that aspect?
So can you give an example? So you're talking about what the industry is doing or what the...
Yeah, fossil fuel industry networks lobbying against sobriety measures. Basically.
Yeah, I don't think they do so much on an individual level. So they would work on the politicians against these measures. And of course, as I said, they're super scared of renewable because it works, and a lot of houses in Australia has it on the roofs. So insulation is not as big a thing, but rooftop solar, a lot of state government is also trying to assist with rooftop solar. And also another point that I missed in responding to the previous question was that the majority of the coal and gas in Australia is for export. So most of the coal and gas doesn't stay in Australia, so it's for export. So which makes the discussion a bit harder because what they're trying to be is preempt larger discussion on climate change, but they're happy to engage in energy discussions in that sense. And because all of those fossil fuel also went for net zero 2050. So we are part of the solution. They're talking about carbon capture and storage. We are part of the solution to address climate change. And sure, they can all be net zero because they aren't counting for the scope 3 emissions. So, we sell the coal to other countries, and when they burn the coal, it's not on BHP or Glencore's or other companies' carbon sheet. It's it's burned somewhere else. And I think that is problem with carbon accounting as well. It's a continuous colonization where the Western world continues to consume. We're laying the problem of burning of all this consumption material in economically less developed countries. So we see a continuous colonization through a lot of these carbon measures, and offsetting, where we reduce our carbon footprints by shifting the dirty production to other countries.
Thank you very much.